This is the lecture for last week. Unfortunately, Wednesday, for those of you who were there, so I had some problems with PowerPoint in my computer, so we were only to do part of the lecture just using the board without PowerPoint. So there were a few things that we didn't get to talk about, and I just want to reiterate them and also point out some of the things that we missed. So we were talking about how you could use a larger sample set of mortuary data in order to tell large-scale changes such as diet, health, and answer other questions concerning religion, ideology, etc. So we're going to just go through a couple of examples. First example is Crow Creek. This is in South Dakota. It's a site from the 1300s AD. It was obviously a Native American village. You can see here it was on a cliff right there, so it had steep sides on two sides, and then the people in the village were trying to build a ditch across this side that was less defensible. What archaeologists found there was evidence of a massacre. And most of these people, there were 500 of them, mostly women and children, they all had evidence of trauma on them, that is, they were killed violently. You can see it's all a jumble of skeletons there. They weren't laid out individually, so they were probably buried by the people who committed this act. And most likely it was done by another village when the men were away, sort of a sneak attack on the village, killing the women and children, and probably some of the men, and burying them all together here. So what archaeologists wanted to know was, what may have led up to this, why did it happen, and what could the skeletal data actually reveal in terms of these questions. So they saw that just looking at the climate data, that looks like there was a drought around the time that this massacre occurred. They were able to see that the ditch was not complete, and so they weren't completely defended because they never completed that ditch. The village was burned at the time of the massacre. So why did this attack occur? Well, they looked at some of the skeletons and they saw that there was lots of evidence for malnutrition. Right, so you can see some of the pock marks here in the orbits, and that's evidence of iron deficiency, right? And also in general food shortage. They also took X-rays of some of the bones, and they saw Harris lines in children. And again, Harris lines show there was growth interruption due to poor nutrition. And so it looks like a drought and the higher population produced some stress on the people in this area. And there's probably competition for food. And one of the villages, went on an attack, not just to, win a battle, but they were there to get rid of their food competitors, basically destroy them, kill them, get rid of them. There was also evidence of post-mortem trauma, right? So things that didn't kill the people, but disfigurement afterwards. And you could see scalping here on the top of the skull, and that was done by Native Americans before European contact, but it increased with European contact. But one of the ideological reasons behind scalping was if you disfigured your enemy's body, they spent basically the afterlife in that condition. Okay, another example also deals with Native Americans, and this is dealing with Native Americans in Florida in the 1500s, pre and post contact. So before the Spaniards arrived, and then the period when the Spaniards were there, sometimes called Mission Period, Florida. What they did first Right, and we talked about this when we talked about archaeometry. You could take stable isotope ratios of bones and you can reconstruct diet that way. And so you could see here the nitrogen and the carbon isotope ratios, and you can see the ratios of more seafood along this axis, more corn along this axis. Right. So if you look at the prehistoric and the late prehistoric, what you see is a diet like this. When you look at sort of Georgia and Florida late prehistoric, you can see it's somewhat similar. But the interesting thing is when you look at mission period, right, Florida and Georgia, you can see there's a real heavy emphasis on corn in the diet, more of an emphasis on corn in the diet, and less on seafood. And so probably their diet, once the Spanish were there, and they had been living under Spanish rule for a while, most likely their diet got worse, not better. They actually had a better diet beforehand, but they were eating more and more corn, which is good in moderation, but if a huge part of your diet is corn, you're going to suffer from some nutritional stress. They also looked at the bones, so not just the stable isotopes of the bones, but the bones themselves. And what they see, they saw there was more infection with mission period Native American bones, right? And you can see that the lesions from bacteria. What else did they see? They also saw scar tissue on some of the bones, right? And this is a vertebra. You know what a normal vertebrae looks like, but you see these pieces right here, that is not normal. This is all calcified scar tissue, and this is from basically the cartilage being worn away where bone is rubbing up against bone, and you get this huge deposits of scar tissue. So this shows that this person was probably in pain later in their life, and it was from heavy work, right? So probably working in the fields, grinding corn, things like that, for lifting things, work that they had to do for the Spanish. Other evidence, joint polish, right? So again, lack of cartilage, bones rubbing up against bone. Actually, you could see where the bone has been rubbing up against other bone. From that starchy diet of more corn, they ended up with more plaque and more cavities, which is something that we have to worry about today, but they didn't have to worry about as much before the Spanish because their diet was more varied. But once the Spanish were there, again, in many, many ways their health was declining. Hypoplasias, all right, these are like Harris lines, and basically it's where the teeth start and stop growing, and it indicates that the person was malnourished at different periods during their lifetime, during their growth periods. Here you can see some other lesions on the skull. A lot of that's from iron deficiency. Cavities, like I mentioned before. Cavities could, in ancient times, could be a serious problem if the cavities developed into an infection or an abscess. That's something that could have killed you in those days. You can see here some other lines on the teeth, right? Again, showing poor diet. When you look at the thickness of the bone, you can see that the bone becomes thicker at the muscle attachments, and this indicates again that there was a increased load on the people. That is, they were performing very, very intensive wearing work. So in all respects, the Native Americans of Florida suffered under Spanish rule. Their diet got worse, their workload increased, they were malnourished compared to earlier, right? And again, the bone data tells us all of this. Okay, something we talked about last week was also your cemetery project, and just for people who weren't there, there are many different kinds of graphs you can do, and we can talk more about that on Monday. But your paper should have be broken down into these sections, although you don't have to label each section individually. But essentially, you want a short abstract, 200 to 300 words, where you basically summarize what you did, and what you found. You want an introduction where you talk about a little bit of the local history with citations, your methods, which, why you chose a certain cemetery, how you chose, what your sampling strategy was, etc. Results. Where you're basically presenting your results. Figure 1 shows, figure 2 shows. Your discussion and your conclusions can be grouped together. It's basically the same thing, but you're giving the big picture sort of analysis of what you learned. Okay, so now we're going to look at not just the physical remains of people, but the cultural aspects of burial. So archaeologists like to figure out rank. Right? That is, was the society complex? Was wealth inherited? Was status inherited? And so there are different ways to do that. So we're going to look at one clear-cut example, and that is looking at the Mississippian period. That is the people of Native America in this part of the Midwest. And one of the largest sites at that time was the site of Cahokia. It's today located in East St. Louis. It's a national park. It's got the largest earthen mound in the Americas. It's called Monk's Mound. This is where archaeologists think elites lived. Right? So they had their huts on top of these mounds. Most of the population was below, and you can see that they also had a section that was cordoned off with a stockade around it. And you can see the rest of the village around here. Some people think the stockade was for defense, but it may have been also to keep the elites in this section where you had Monk's Mound, you had a plaza with ceremonial events going on, and keeping the rest of the population out in terms of access. This is how Monk's Mound would have been built, right? Basket load of dirt by basket load of dirt. This required a huge amount of labor. It required organization. So one of the discoveries they made in terms of burials was Mound 72. And here they found ceremonial, sacrificial human burials. A lot of them were young women. In particular, they found a main burial of what looks like an important male, 45, on a blanket of 20,000 marine shell disc beads. Right? That is, these shells were gotten from the ocean and then by hand, by craft specialists, we assume, were made into beads. So 20,000 of these disc beads. So obviously this person had wealth with them. When you're talking about the labor that went into producing these craft goods, a lot of labor went in. Next to him were 53 women between the ages of 15 and 25 who were sacrificed with him. So not only material wealth, but also human life. Okay, so you could see some of the burials here. Some of them were buried on litters, on platforms. You also had 4 men without hands and without heads. They were decapitated and their hands were cut off. And this might be the reenactment of a myth from this time. But again, it shows you the importance of that ruler. At least this is what archaeologists assume, that there's one main person who has all these things associated with his grave, and shows that there was a real difference between the very top and the very bottom. Right? There were grave goods also, other grave goods as well. This is the main individual, so you could see him resting on 20,000 of these shell beads. Right? This is in the museum there, and this is a reconstruction of what it may have looked like. There's again the decapitated men. Again, you can see, the archaeologists did not miss anything. It's not like they missed the bones. The bones of the hands and the heads were not there. They were decapitated. So the assumption is that this is the burial of a chief, one of the main rulers of Cahokia. After he died, he was given this lavish burial. And so lavish burials of a few individuals is usually clear evidence that you have a ranked society. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. Okay, one thing you should also be aware of is one of the laws that was passed in the 90s and then further bolstered by other legislation. And this is the called NAGPRA, Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, usually just called NAGPRA. And basically what it allows is universities and museums that excavate the Native American burials and have those skeletons in their collections or on display, those things can be returned to Native American tribes that basically petition to have them returned. So these are things that were excavated by universities or museums, or today on federal land, if Native American remains are found, then the tribe or tribes must be contacted. And it could be either a tribe that can show a historical link to the individual or the individuals who were buried, or the tribe who happens to be in that area during that time, if no historical link can be generated. So this is something that anyone who wants to work in North America, on North American archaeology, has to be aware of. However, with private property, this law does not pertain. So if you find Native American burials on your own property, you can actually do with them what you will, which in my personal opinion is a little crazy, I think. This should apply to all land, I think, personally, or at least the protection of these remains. And so this is just a little bit more about them. So we at Grand Valley had Native American remains, and Professor Brashler, Professor Madden had to spend a lot of time going through the collection, contacting and communicating with different tribes in order to get these things repatriated for burial. Okay, so sometimes it could be a little tricky to show who who has the right to have these remains returned, and so sometimes it could be actually pretty controversial. As we said, these are there was actually artifacts not only in our own collection, but artifacts from a burial from Norton Mounds that was actually in the public museum, and the public museum reburied these artifacts with Native Americans present at Norton Mounds. Okay, one of the most controversial finds in terms of Native American burials is Kennewick Man. Kennewick Man dates back to about 7,000 years ago, from the period right after the Clovis period. He was found by accident. His skeleton was eroding from the riverbank. Kayakers or canoers thought it was a murder victim. They called in the police. Police quickly realized it was an archaeological site. Called in archaeologists, and the archaeologists chatters who started working on Kennewick did not contact the local tribes about this find. And so when the tribes found out about the find in the newspaper, they were rightfully a little miffed that they weren't involved in this, and so they sued to have Kennewick Man returned. Kennewick Man was controversial in a lot of ways. A lot of people who looked at the skull thought that it had Caucasian-like features. Right? Remember when we talked about race, earlier, when you guys were actually trying to identify race on skeletons, on skulls. It could be a little tricky. And one of the reconstructions, people, amusingly said bears a similarity to Patrick Stewart. So some people are saying maybe this is evidence that that Europeans, that Caucasians, were the first people in North America before Native Americans arrived. And it's totally ridiculous. All the evidence shows that this person came from the Siberian Central area, a region where most Native Americans originated from. And in terms of his features, not looking like what we consider classic Native American features, they actually look very, very similar to the native people of Japan, the Ainu. This is, what an Ainu person looks like. They don't look like the modern Japanese. They were actually the people there before the Japanese people arrived, and they were pushed up to the northern part of the country. So the features are actually consistent with it being an ancestor of a Native American. But the archaeologists countersued to not have the burial returned because they wanted to have it in the museum collection so it could be studied, indefinitely. They also said that, we're talking about 7,000 BC. It's really hard to show any link to a modern-day tribe over that length of time. To Native Americans, it doesn't matter. They think any grave is ancestral in some way, so it should be returned to a tribe. And so there was a suit and a countersuit, and it went back and forth in the courts with, I think one time the Native Americans won possession, it was going to be repatriated, and then the archaeologists won the next countersuit. Right? And some people have pointed out, instead of trying, sorry, this is a little hard to read here. Oops. Okay, trying to. Okay. All right. Yeah, instead of trying to forge a mutual interest with Native Americans and discovering who these ancestors of us all were, we throw in their faces that they are not the original Americans after all. And that is the one thing they have in their culture to hang on to in the face of overwhelming dominance of others. So there have been students at Grand Valley who have Native American ancestry who have gone on to major in anthropology and become archaeologists. So there is sort of a middle ground between the two extremes of archaeologists who want to keep remains and not involve Native Americans and keep the remains for as long as they feel necessary, which could be forever, and then some of the extreme Native views where they don't want any scientific research going on at all. There is a happy medium between these two groups, and there can be some kind of compromise between them. Okay, imagine if no archaeologist could study Native American remains. This would be a huge data set that would be lost, essentially, in terms of study and what we could say about Native American past. And of course, some Native Americans realize, well, this benefits us in the sense because we learn about our own history. Okay, so there is a compromise that sometimes is reached between communities. This doesn't really deal with NAGPRA, but sometimes Native American remains are stolen for different purposes. So the story has it, and this is, it hasn't been confirmed, but the story has it that George W. Bush's grandfather, Prescott Bush, who was a member of Skull and Bones secret society at Yale University, stole Geronimo's skull from his grave in Arlington National Cemetery, and they used this skull in some of their initiation rites in Skull and Bones. Skull and Bones, is a secret society, so they just deny it. The skull is missing. The Apache tribe, again, it's not hard to show a link here. The Apache's still around. The Apache tribe is sued to have the skull returned, but it has not gotten anywhere. Okay. So with mortuary remains, like in Cahokia, you can learn about social organization. That is, do you have classes? Do you have inheritance of wealth and status? Do you have hierarchy? And then also you could learn about religion, symbolism, right? So if someone is buried in a certain way, does it actually indicate anything about the religion or the belief system of the people? We talked a little bit about Saxe and Binford, right? Louis Binford. They basically came up with a set of hypotheses in order to study mortuary remains. And one of the most important is that the way you're treated in death indicates the way you were perceived during your life. So you could tell about a person's status in their life by looking at their mortuary remains. And you know, this is done with the your descendants, or the person's descendants. That is, your status continues even after you're dead, even after your death. So some of the famous elite burials that have been found by archaeologists, of course, King Tut's tomb is one. I mean, that's way on the end of the spectrum. But you also have elites in Iron Age Europe, such as in the Hallstatt burials in Germany. So you can see one individual buried in a grave that took a fair amount of labor, and then buried with these luxury items: gold daggers, bronze daggers, items of wealth. You have the same thing in some areas, like in Syria. This were graves we think of an elite family. So you have the people buried here with fine pots in a central location in the city. So again, you can indicate status by artifacts, by the amount of labor that went into the burial, that is a mound or tomb, and also by location. These are some of the things that can indicate to you high investment or low investment. So you can see some of those in Syria. Some of these graves had luxury goods, so lapis lazuli, bronze and gold pins. Lapis lazuli is a blue stone that comes from Afghanistan. Okay, another hypothesis they came up with is that visible tombs, mortuary remains, can actually serve as territorial markers for villages. That is, and you can still see these megalithic tombs in Europe. Village communities can mark their territory by creating a large communal tomb that was visible on the landscape. And so anyone walking in this area would see this tomb, and they would recognize that now they were in the territory of another group. Here you can see some of these passage tombs right here. And these tombs got quite large later on when they were used for single individuals, and that shows that there was an increase in hierarchy. So group burials are usually tied to membership, right? And so being a member of a group is important, that is also reflected sometimes in mortuary treatment. So in our society, family groups are sometimes shown in mortuary data by family plots like these. So even in egalitarian societies, and this is what we talked a little bit about on Wednesday, even in egalitarian societies where people are roughly equal, you still see differences in how people are buried. And those differences can be based on gender, they can be based on age, with elders getting more treatment in their burial than younger individuals, or it could be based on a group or a lineage, right? So being a member of a lineage or being a member of a secret society within that group. Right, so here you can see some of the mounds for probably a lineage in Native America. Okay, so again, with egalitarian societies, you still see differences. Typically, men and women are buried with different things. Also, older individuals have more objects in their grave and maybe a higher status burial in general than people who are younger, because they've achieved more during their lifetime. So if you were looking at the graves of a community and you said, look, some people have more in their burial than others, that shows it was hierarchical. That shows it was a ranked society, it was a complex society. Not necessarily, right? Not necessarily. You have to look at who has that rank. Is it mainly older individuals? What's the difference in rank? Again, it could be an egalitarian society. Okay, so again, one of the things you look at is wealth artifacts, location, and the investment or the labor that went into the burial. So status relationships will entitle the deceased to a larger amount of corporate involvement, group involvement in the act of interment. So for example, these are burials in New Guinea of the recent past. And the higher status people, the higher status men, were buried further up on the cliff face than lower status people. And you can see that there's a difference in location and investment, because it takes more work to get the burial up to this high point. You could see it pretty high up than it does to a lower part. And in New Guinea today, ancestors are still worshipped. So this is, might have been a tribe society. There might have been some differences between the people. But what about true hierarchy, real complex hierarchy like we see in Cahokia? Well, the way you're able to do this is to look at the levels of investment, right? That is, let's say Group 1 is buried in mounds and has lots of artifacts. Group 2 is buried in a cemetery within the village and has few artifacts, but still a good amount of artifacts. And then Group 3 is buried in the cemetery outside the village with a few pots. Right? Those are 3 different levels. If membership in these different groups or levels was completely random, then you would expect there would be an equal number of people in each of these ranks. So if you had, 1,000 people, you'd expect 330 individuals to be in each of these 3 ranks. However, if it's a rank society, then what you see is something very different. So for example, Moundville is a site down in southeast North America, roughly the same time period as Cahokia. They found 3,100 burials from different time periods, and there were different levels. So the very top level, people were buried in mounds. They had copper artifacts. They had shell beads. Right. The next step down, you can see this cluster over here: effigy vessels, animal bone, right? Shell gorgets. There were cemeteries near the mounds, and then the final group had bowls and jars, some sherds, and they were in cemeteries either near the mounds or outside of the mounds. Right? And what they were able to do is they looked at the number of people in each of these groups. So here you can see A, B, and C. And in the group that had the largest burials, the most and the wealthiest burials, there were very few people. You can see the majority of the people were in this bottom rank, right? So we're talking about, you have about 100 people here, and down at the bottom, with no grave goods, you have 1,200, and then you have something like 200 to 300 with a few grave goods, right? So if you have the large amount of the population, like 80% or more, has no grave goods, and then a small number of people have a large amount of grave goods, that's a rank society. That's a complex society, right? So there you can say, yes, the differences are actually indicating rank. Also, if you look at ages and you find any child burials in this high rank, this rank that had a lot of investment, that shows to you that wealth and status is inherited, because no child is able to achieve that kind of wealth and status on their own. So that's another good indication. So again, in egalitarian societies, the older people are usually buried with a little bit more than the young. But in these rank societies, you have young people, children, who have more wealth than a majority of the population. Okay, there's other interesting things that archaeologists are finding out looking at burials. One is designation of burials in terms of male and female. Originally, when burials in Eurasia were discovered in these kurgan mounds with weapons, they were assumed to be male because they had weapons. When they looked carefully at the skeletons later on, they realized that these were women. And so these were probably related to the Amazons, the female warriors from the Eurasian steppe that came in contact with the Greeks and who sort of got immortalized in their history as the Amazons. You also could learn about religious beliefs. So in ancient times and also in modern times, you have something known as sky burials. This is where the body is laid out and vultures pick away at the body, and they're basically lifting the soul of that person up to the sky, and then the people can take the skeletal remains and bury them with ceremony somewhere else. And so again, that's a specific religious belief. Someone buried face down in many societies is usually indicates someone with either low status or someone who's broken the rules of the society, right? And so that's usually a good indication that that this person has been disgraced. Another example of this was a site that I worked on when I was an undergrad, where in a ceremonial chamber that was no longer used, they found 3 bodies with rocks thrown on top of them. One of them also had an arrow in the hip. They found a male, a young child, and a female. In another part of the site, they also found another one of those ceremonial chambers that was set on fire. Person had an arrow in their thigh, and they had their head in the ventilator shaft trying to get air as this ceremonial chamber burned. Well, some archaeologists have looked at this and said, these people were killed, but they weren't just, this was not just an argument where they killed a bunch of people and then threw them somewhere. They deliberately killed them within a ceremonial religious chamber. And so looking at that, what some people have hypothesized is that these people were accused of witchcraft, right? Because witches are treated very differently than just someone that you have an argument with, because they have power, they have supernatural power, and you have to nullify that supernatural power some way. And so sometimes destroying them in a ceremonial chamber can nullify their magic. Okay. There's other religious beliefs that you can get at, and we'll just talk about one example. Things like the Egyptian pharaohs being buried on the west bank of the Nile. The west was the area of the setting sun, right? That was considered the land of the dead, etc. So you can learn a lot about the belief system of a society looking at their burials. So, give you an example. Dolne Vista Noche is a prehistoric site, Paleolithic site, where they found some of this artwork. But they also found 3 burials. 3 people were buried together that were kind of interesting. This is about 26,000 years ago. They found a female in the center, right, who had some spinal problems, an undeveloped right leg. Then they had a male with a spear through his hip who was reaching towards some red ochre that was between the legs of the female. This larger male was face down, and all 3 skulls were covered in red ochre, and this body also was wearing a mask. So this is kind of puzzling what was going on. Some people think maybe it was sort of a love triangle gone wrong, a woman who had died in childbirth. Other people think maybe this was a woman who died in childbirth, and the shaman and the husband were killed with her. This one made the press a while ago when it was found in Italy. It's called the Romeo and Juliet of the ancient world, right? It's a man and woman in an embrace, buried together. Jericho, ancient Jericho from about the Neolithic, gives some very interesting evidence of early religion in that area. And what was going on is skulls of individuals were removed from burials and plastered over to recreate the features of that person or that individual, and these were displayed in houses and then buried underneath house floors. Here you can see some other examples. And the hypothesis of what this represented usually is that these were ancestors, and that ancestors were worshipped at this time. So it's similar to what you see in some parts of Asia, right, where ancestors are worshipped and there are shrines with the ancestors' names on them, on plaques. Ancestors can have part of the table set for them at ceremonies, etc. Right? And so this was kind of a religion based on an ancestor cult. archaeologists realized by looking at the remains from Jericho. Okay, well that's as far as I really wanted to go with this week. So what we're going to talk about on Monday and Wednesday is historical archaeology, battlefield archaeology, and we will also get into some of the sort of wrapping up of the course. So see you guys on Monday.